I'd like to introduce Ty Morton. He's going to tell us about selling clients on Expression Engine. Give a warm welcome to Ty.
Good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. I've been to many conferences, and the last day, the first morning of the last day, which is always after the party, is always the easiest one to look at and go, I don't know if I need to do that one. So I really appreciate everybody being here. So, a little bit about myself. I actually started out as a theater major and started developing websites in 1994 when I discovered the World Wide Web. And back then, a lot of early adopters of the internet, of the web, were not-for-profit organizations, small groups that were looking to leverage the low cost of entry to get into to reach people and talk about what they were doing. After a few years, I became director of new media for Terry Kane Orlando, a full-service advertising agency in Orlando. Back then, my job was, what I was hired to do was basically to build their web department because they were still very much the traditional style of advertising agency, and their client stable was not very internet savvy yet. So much so that my title changed like 4 or 5 times. I used to be, they decided they were going to call it new media because that was the term at the time. And I was originally hired as the new media director. And then anytime somebody would call and ask for the new media director, the actual media director would get all nervous because he thought he was losing his job. So they had to switch us around a little bit. I found my own agency, Chelonian Studio, 2007, and I started working with Expression Engine about a decade ago. So now back then, in the early days of it, the big thing was browser wars. About the first decade of my career was very much about a static internet. There was no such thing as a search engine. There was no, in fact, if you wanted to find out what websites were available on the internet, one of the things you would do is you would go to the bookstore and you would buy this phone book that was the directory of websites. And also, every single programming code had some kind of coffee theme name to it. So Java, espresso beans, all of that, most of which are as dead as Latin now. So, but I'm fluent in about 15 dead languages. And the web's design at the time was all very print-centric. That was the only thing people really knew what to do. So especially when graphic designers started shifting to becoming web designers. So everything was about sort of replicating the magazine format or the newspaper format or something like that to it. But there was a real ease of entry for developers at the time because back in from 1994 to about 1996, 97, there were 40 HTML tags you had to learn, and that was it. There was no CSS, there was no PHP, there was no, I mean, those things were in the process of being developed, but they were not readily available or used at the time. So, and that's how you wind up with stuff like this. This website continues to exist today. This is for the movie Space Jam, and this was considered a high-end corporate website at the time, complete with frames, if you remember those, and the spinning icons, and yeah, it was a little bit of a mess. But eventually we grew out of it into sort of an awkward adolescent stage. Design standards started to evolve. Everything was about Flash. In fact, Flash was a major part of my work at the time, and I went to a couple of conferences that were Flash-centric conferences with entire agencies that were just, that was all that they did. So, and I don't know what they do now, because, but in all of that time, the most common client question that was ever asked anytime we pitched a website project to anybody was, can I edit it myself? And the answer was largely no. So there were no content management systems at the time. In fact, at the time, the term content management system didn't even exist. It was called web content management. And it was largely reserved for large business, enterprise sites. E-commerce was still kind of a new thing, but if you were working in that direction. You started to have some rudimentary CMS architecture in place, but for the most part, there really wasn't much of anything. So, and then CMS exploded. All of a sudden, there were 1 million content management systems, largely because PHP really started to take off. People started to embrace it. A lot of the other similar programming languages, C and flat files and things like that, all started to fall away. But PHP and MySQL managed to come into enough maturity that everybody embraced it. And all of a sudden, we went from a period where there were no content management systems to where there were 1 million. So, and most of them sucked. And almost all of them were also focused on blogs. Even Expression Engine started out as a blogging platform. So, and that was what everybody was trying to do, and that's what the CMS market was trying to focus its attention on. And so then the challenge became, how do you take a blogging platform and work it around into being something you can actually build a website off of? So, and there were a lot of really awkward ways to do that and make that happen, and a lot of them didn't work. But Expression Engine was different, and because it had a level of flexibility and extensibility that sort of set it apart from things at the time. Movable type was a big player in that. WordPress eventually rose to the forefront in that, but WordPress even today is still a difficult kind of a platform to adapt into a website that isn't a blog-based type of thing. So selling Expression Engine at the time, Expression Engine also was a paid product. It's only been an open source recently, as you guys all know, but back at the time when it was a paid product, there were very few of those. So movable type was a paid product, but as like Joomla and Drupal and all these other ones started to emerge as open source projects, clients tried to gravitate to them, tended to gravitate to them, and the challenge of selling Expression Engine to clients was a little bit more difficult. But the key to it was you didn't have to, the key to it was Expression Engine allowed you to basically do whatever you wanted with the content and the site. You could establish, you could build the channels out, they called them web blogs at the time. But you could build all of those things out. You could build out your custom fields a lot more readily than you could, and your templating system was a lot more robust. So whereas WordPress was more about, well, what kind of blog theme do you want for your website? And it became more of taking the content and reapplying it in different ways to make that work. Expression Engine was easier, where you could just make the hole fit the peg. So it was a lot more sellable at that point. So, and then everything got crazy. WordPress began to evolve rapidly. There were a lot of CMSs in competition with one another. So open source grew up, and we went from having 1 million open source content management systems to having a handful of them in rotation. And that became driven almost as much by developers as it did by clients. Because nobody has time to learn 16 different things. You sort of narrow in on the 4 that best suit you, and everybody started doing that, and it wound up thinning the field just a little bit. So also now software as a service has begun replacing designers. Management systems like Squarespace and Wix, sell themselves on this idea that, well, you could just build your own website and do whatever you want with it. And so that's made it even more difficult to sell larger development projects, especially well, first let me ask a question. Who here, the majority of your clients, would you consider to be small businesses? That's almost everybody here. So it's not everybody gets that Target account, or gets the larger accounts that involve large e-commerce structures with thousands and thousands of products and things that you get to develop for. Most of us are working for banks and realtors and schools and museums and not-for-profits and all of that. So the Squarespace and Wix models have become much more attractive to them because they look at the even lower cost of entry than a WordPress site is, for example. So, and that has all made Expression Engine harder to sell. Well, LS Lab decided, well, we're not going to sell it at all anymore. We'll just make it open source, and we'll make our money in other ways. And that's worked out great in terms of software cost. But in terms of development cost, developing an expression engine site is still a much larger endeavor than a WordPress site or anything else that's similar to that. So the trick becomes, how do you convince the client that that investment is going to be worth it when beyond just the capabilities of the website itself? Well, this is not the way to do it. But what we can do is go beyond the browser and start looking at what the client's needs are and where they're allocating their resources internally as opposed to externally. So Expression Engine has a very robust framework. A lot of what I did early days as well was I did a lot of relational database work. I used to especially did a lot of custom development with a product called FileMaker Pro, and which had its merits, but in terms of extensibility and using it to work, to transfer web data and all of that was not really great. But at the end of the day, Expression Engine really just is a big relational database. So, and most other applications that clients are paying for other purposes are themselves relational databases. So when we talk about things like the digital ecosystem, and most models of that will illustrate that as an outwardly projecting entity. So you have your website and how that fits with your social media and all these other things. Whereas what we found out is that if you look internally, there might be a lot of other extensible things about Expression Engine that you can apply that helps the client replace other functions. And by that, other functions, I mean other expenses. And to make that all work together. So, all of that being said, the history lesson is now over. So we'll get into a couple of examples of some projects. This is HTC Dev. This project was developed in 2009. This was the developer site for HTC phones. And at the time that this project was underway, HTC was the big dog in the Android market. So they were the second largest smartphone producer behind Apple, and slowly, well, actually more quickly than slowly, Samsung wound up taking over. But prior to that, HTC was the big player. So what they wanted to do was they wanted a website that was a portal to another service that they were paying for, to catalog kernel source codes and manage bootloader unlocking functionality. So what that means is that they would have the codes for every model of every phone that they had, and then they had this tool called Unlock Bootloader tool that allowed you to essentially unlock your phone and install custom firmware so that for testing and all of that. So, well, they're in Taiwan, and they have this company that's providing this repository service, and they provide the code for unlocking the bootloader and all of that. And it is incredibly expensive, especially considering they're looking at having a target of over 8 million registered developers, which they've met. So the repository cost was based on the number of developers that they were registering for it. So they were looking at tens of thousands of dollars to just maintain this catalog of kernel source codes, and then have this website that is basically the marketing portion of it, at the front end. And the company didn't really have much of an API, basically amounted to serving the portal up in an iframe. And it was a horrible mess. And then we looked at it and thought, well, actually, everything that this repository service does for you, you can do in Expression Engine. The number of users presented some challenges to manage. So, but apart from that, it wound up working out pretty well. Oops. So what we end up with here is these are all their kernel source codes. On the back end of all of this, the way the system works is you register yourself as a developer. You go and you request all the kernel source codes. When you request them, they're not just simple download links. They're actually little forms that go in so that the HTC is able to track which developers are downloading which source codes. And then also, too, the same goes for the Unlock Bootloader app utility. So, whereas, you just go through and you select your device, and you go through the process, you log in. Yeah, well, I'm not a live demos. But anyway, it goes through this whole process where it gives you this code, enter your phone, and you work all this out. And then you can unlock it and then install the new code and everything else. And all of that activity is tracked on the back end. So HTC has this full log of all the developer activity. They know which kernel source codes are more popular. They're able to apply analytics to all of it. And the site is 10 years old and still functioning. And this process in there wound up saving them somewhere in the neighborhood of like $28,000 a year. So over that 10-year time, they've more than paid for the website and for everything else. And that became the selling point for them. So now, on the other end of the scale is Cornerstone Center for the Arts. This is a little art education center in Muncie, Indiana. They do not have HTC's budget or HTC's numbers you lop a couple of zeros off of the development cost of all of this. But what they did have their own challenges as well, though, because one of the things that they do is they have events, event management and rentals and all of that for weddings and graduation and proms. So, and they also have this education program where parents register their kids for the classes, and both of those programs were being managed by third-party software on the outside. So what they would do is they would have the website, user would fill out the form, say, I'm interested in doing this. That person would have to go around and turn to either their education management software that they were using or their event management software that they were using and enter all of the information in there. And those products came with annual license fees. So they're spending somewhere in the neighborhood of about $5,000 a year on these two software products that are just creating a redundancy. And not only that, they've got a staff of like 10 people. So it becomes a personnel bandwidth issue as well. Oops. So let's go here. So, and as you can see, their typical month, they have a lot of events going on. So it's so going through and managing all of these events, what room are they in, who's staffing, who's in charge, who's on site, and all of those things was its own hairball in one sense. And then on the education side, they not only have to get the classes all set up and manage all of that, there's also this reporting component that they do because they report income levels and race and gender and all to the state of Indiana for grant purposes. So what we were able to do with this project was go through and take away all of those things and set it all up so that it was all an expression engine. For example, on the education program side, the registration form contained all the information they needed for the class, for the reporting, for everything else. And then we were able to script out these various templates to produce the documents they needed to submit. And all they had to do at the end of the month was click a button, and it submitted their report to the state, it submitted the report to their grant agencies, and everything else, and saved them not so much time as it was money, or not so much money as it was time and the workload on the staff. So in between is Orlando Museum of Art. This is a large-ish art museum in Orlando. It's probably similar to the one here in Minneapolis. So, and they needed a new website. They do also do some event rentals and things like that, but not nearly at the level that other clients have. But their big issue was being an art museum, they had this expensive and horrible collections management software. And when I say horrible, I'm not joking. This is what it was. This is actually how it still is today. But essentially, it is just another relational database to catalog all of their artwork. So there are a few challenges to it because artists are weird, and they don't necessarily all work in conventional methods. So something that was a sort of a flat file would not accommodate this, because you have one artist, you'll have artwork that is a collaboration from 3 other different artists who also have their own collections and their own artwork and their own things. So there was a little bit of a challenge to that, but it was readily manageable because of the way Expression Engine is set up. First, there were add-ons like Playa that allowed you to do that, and then the Expression Engine's own native relationship field type became a huge benefit for that. So the other issue was they had limited staff bandwidth. So much like other not-for-profit organizations, the art museum had one person who was in charge of curating and cataloging all of the artwork. And that same person was also in charge of when they brought new artwork in and new pieces, and also if they put something out on loan so it was no longer available to view at the museum, they had to go through and also update that on the back end of the website that they had. So they're doing double duty on every single thing that they do. Also, because the website was not connected to the collections management software, there was no way for them to put into place any kind of a loan request. So one of the things that is a big moneymaker for art museums is loaning out their work to corporations. So a lot of banks, a lot of big offices and all that will borrow artwork for their lobby in exchange for a large donation. So it's a big income generator for them that can be difficult to manage. So what we did was we used Expression Engine to replace their collections manager. So shoot.
Just use a password for all of them.
1, 2, 3, 4. Good to know. So what we wound up doing was basically reproducing that same tool that they're already paying all this money for in the back end of their website. As you can see, it performs all the same functions. You can select the multiple artists if it's a collaborative project, go through, view the work, all of that. Same thing with all the artist info. And basically not only replaced it, but improved it, because this is a much cleaner, a much nicer interface. Even if you built this in EE2, it still looks 1,000 times better than that turd that the other thing that they had before. So, and what wind up happening now, at the same time, that utility that they're using, they're paying another annual license of about $4,800 for this product. So, and that's not even with they had another utility called Web Kiosk that would take the database of the management software and basically produce web content for it. But you couldn't export that web content into anything else. You had to basically use their kiosk as it, and it was awful. It didn't work on a phone. I mean, it's 2017 at the time we're building this, and they are not. Oh yeah, we're going to work on that. Oh, do you want to help us with that? Sure, we'd be happy to, write you up an estimate for that. Oh, no. We just thought maybe you just, out of the love of the work, you'd want to. And no, that didn't go. So, okay. So, But basically, though, we wound up saving them enough money to pay for the cost of the development. Not in 1 year, but they over about a 3-year period. After about a 3-year period, they'll have recouped everything that they wound up spending on the website, almost just in the savings that they're getting from not having to purchase this product anymore. So, and on our end, really didn't take that much work. It wasn't a lot of what makes these software packages and developments challenging is the user interface of it. So like you saw on the gallery management system, it was horrible looking, but I bet somebody was really proud of that. So they spent a lot of time and a lot of work on it, and they crafted those bevels and made it all look really good in their mind. So, but I would imagine that was probably 50% of the work of the development of that app. So, with the Expression Engine backend, you've got something that the client's already going to be familiar with using and applying it to other things that they're doing. So, when we're trying to sell Expression Engine development to clients, and we start talking about things like their digital ecosystem, one of the things that we want to do is get them to not only look outwardly, but also look inwardly into it. Because Expression Engine can replace virtually any relational data operation you could probably think of. And if not by itself, with the extensions and add-ons that are available out there. And also the way that the Expression Engine developer network tends to work, if there's not an add-on out there that does a thing you need to do, it's not hard to get one built. So it's a little trickier to build one yourself, and I don't personally recommend that. But a lot of people do it and do it well. So there's solutions out there that at the end of the day will be much cheaper for the client to pass that along to. So when you sit down with the client and you're doing your initial discovery to give the proposal of it, and you're trying to get an idea of the whole scope of their digital ecosystem and what they have going on, one of the things that you should do is also look inward into it. So what are you spending your money on the other aspects of your operation that are creating redundancy with what you're doing with your web content? And maybe if we can remove that piece of the puzzle, we also remove the expense and the cost that comes with it. And that makes Expression Engine a much more attractive product, and the development aspects, the development of it, much more impressive as well. So that's all I have. It was an early morning one, so I thought I'd keep it short. Does anybody have any questions?
Have you ever done anything around the ERP system to kind of take things out of an ERP and move it into an Expression Engine instead? Or do you always leave it as a third party in that case?
We haven't. So yeah, pretty much everything has just been with starting with the Expression Engine and trying to replicate the third party operation and all of that.
So with these examples, like, I guess taking this to the Expression Engine point, why do this in Expression Engine versus other CMSs that might have some flexibility to it as well to do these things? Like, what was it about Expression Engine in particular that you chose to do these things?
Well, honestly, part of it is familiarity. So I was familiar with how it worked and with the structure of it. Part of it, too, is also simplicity. So the way Expression Engine is a complex product, but when you get down to the bare bones of its framework, it's actually pretty streamlined and pretty simple. So and other CMSs that are geared towards specific types of functions, you wind up having to do all these little hacky things to get from point A to point B. And we found out with the Expression Engine, you don't really have to do that. You can rely on its native structure and just modify it a little bit and tweak it here and there. Maybe kick off a little script once in a while to get rid of about 2 million inactive users on a site. So actually, the HTC side, we did have to do that. It became a problem because users were forgetting their names, their passwords, and instead of trying to just reset their password, would just have a new one. So we had all these people that just hadn't been logged in forever, and you can't scroll through all of this. So we had to, actually with Robin's help, had to write a script that would go through and get all the inactive users and kick them off, and work that out. But those types of things become really readily manageable, whereas in some other content management systems, that kind of operation would be, in some cases, impossible.
Have some of your older sites, when it comes to upgrade time, do the clients at that point want to stay with Expression Engine, or do you have any difficulties? Do they change their mind, just the grass is always greener?
We haven't had that be the case. We have had that be the case in one instance, and that was because they started out in Expression Engine 1, and migrating from 1 to 2 was horrible. It was a horrible experience. I mean, if you want to see a grown man cry in front of his computer. So they decided they wanted to move on to something else because the prospect of upgrading from 2 to 3 didn't look a lot better. So, but in the Orlando Museum of Art's case, when we started out, they started out on 2, and upgrading to 3 was a horrible experience. When 4 came out, we went, oh, we want to go do this, and they went, no, absolutely not. And then we explained to them, no, it's not that big, I promise. This is a one-day deal, and then after that, it's just push a button. So, but yeah, there was a little bit of, I don't know really how to phrase it, but there was a little bit of upgrade fear for a lot of those. But now that we're kind of down that road a little bit, so it's a lot easier to manage those. Is that it?
Just sort of curious, how many third-party add-ons do you tend to average? Like 3 or 4, or 30 or 40?
Oh, I usually stick to 10 or less. So, and some of them I'll avoid altogether if I can. I hope nobody's here from Soul Space, but Calendar just is a nightmare sometimes, and there are others that But in the instance of like the Cornerstone Center for the Arts, Calendar is like the bulk, the workhorse of their site. So as long as it's working, everything else is golden and great. So, but no, I try to keep it trimmed down as much as possible. I've worked with other developers, Expression Engine developers, that they'll start out a site, they'll do the Expression Engine install, and they'll drop in 25 add-ons, just right off the bat. WordPress developers are the same way. They'll go, oh, I'm going to put this in, and I'm going to put this plugin, this plugin, this plugin, all these. Whether they know they need them or not, they just sort of have this base set that they like to work with, and then that you wind up just having to update more things as time goes on, even though you're not actually using them. So yeah, I try to keep it lean. All right, well, thank you guys very much. Happy Friday.